Friend, thank you for being here today. What happens when a trade war that began over steel and lumber spills over into a battle for the most essential resource of all? How does a quiet diplomatic relationship transform into a high-stakes confrontation for survival? As we observe the unfolding events, it becomes clear that the trade conflict between Canada and the United States has brought renewed attention to the Port of Churchill, which is now poised to become a significant strategic asset. We are witnessing a scenario where President Trump's trade policies are negatively impacting American ports, with bookings for container shipments having plummeted by almost 50% compared to last year. This sharp decline in cargo at United States ports driven by tariffs creates a unique opportunity for the Canadian port to help domestic products find new international markets in a fraction of the usual time. I have analyzed the data, and as the threat of tariffs has grown, interest in the port has surged. Meanwhile, the Port of Los Angeles, typically the busiest in the Western Hemisphere, is bracing for a major slowdown. But beyond these trade disputes, I want us to look deeper, because a different kind of conflict is emerging across North America, one that has nothing to do with tariffs or shipping lanes. This new struggle is over a more fundamental resource, water. We see that President Donald Trump has targeted Canada's rivers and lakes, framing them as essential for America's survival as severe drought conditions worsen throughout the South. The demand is aggressive, the pressure is constant, and the rhetoric from Washington intensifies each week. In Ottawa, the government's response has been one of firm defiance. Prime Minister Mark Carney, previously recognized for his low-key career in finance, has been unexpectedly thrust into a role he never sought, defending Canada's national sovereignty. Disputes that began over steel, lumber, and automobiles have now escalated into a confrontation that threatens to shift the balance of power on the continent. The central question has become unavoidable for all of us watching. How far will this conflict escalate before the demand for water leads to something far more perilous? President Trump's latest announcement has ignited one of the most contentious disputes in the history of United States-Canada relations. Speaking from a stage in Washington, he portrayed Canada's rivers as an enormous untapped reserve that could relieve America's drought-afflicted regions and bring stability to states desperate for water. Central to his argument was the Columbia River, a waterway that flows for over 2,000 kilometers through the Pacific Northwest, originating in British Columbia before crossing into the United States. We must note that his demand came just as Washington suspended talks to modernize the 1961 Columbia River Treaty. This was an agreement that for decades had meticulously balanced flood control needs and hydroelectric power benefits for both nations. In a single statement, Trump converted water from a matter of shared stewardship into a political bargaining chip, implying that the United States would now view Canada's rivers as resources it could claim for its own survival. The reaction in Ottawa was one of immediate shock. Environmental organizations, indigenous communities, and advocacy groups quickly formed a united front. They warned that surrendering control over water would trigger consequences that extend far beyond a single river. We saw more than 80 coalitions publicly condemn the demand, describing it as a direct attack on Canadian sovereignty. Prime Minister Mark Carney, a leader known more for his financial acumen than for confrontational politics, replied with unusual forcefulness. He declared unequivocally that Canada was not for sale and that its lakes and rivers would never be treated as commodities for foreign powers. His statement was delivered with a clear sense of finality, establishing a boundary that would not be moved. In a matter of hours, what were once standard negotiations transformed into a global standoff, observed with increasing anxiety, not only in North America, but in capitals worldwide. The refusal from Ottawa came with an immediate price for the United States. Western states, which had been led to expect new supplies of Canadian water, were suddenly confronted with the stark realization that this relief was not coming. We can see the impact on states like California, Nevada, and Arizona, which had been depending on diversions to sustain their farmland, secure crop harvest, and alleviate the strain of a prolonged drought. In California's Central Valley, which is responsible for a large share of America's fruit and vegetable supply, farmers had been instructed to get ready for additional water that was now never going to arrive. The promises were replaced by the sight of empty canals and tighter water allocations, fueling a sense of betrayal that resonated throughout America's agricultural core. The economic fallout was massive. California's agricultural production supplies a significant portion of the nation's food, nearly 40% of its vegetables and two-thirds of its fruits and nuts. Without sufficient water, harvest began to fail. Yields dropped, and prices at the supermarket started to rise. Families already struggling with inflation felt the direct impact in their grocery budgets. While economists cautioned that shortages of key products like lettuce, almonds, and tomatoes would create disruptions across global supply chains, a political statement made in Washington had now directly affected the dinner tables of average American households. However, agriculture was merely the first industry to experience the shock. Trump had presented Canadian water as a vital component of America's industrial expansion and technological dominance, and corporations had taken him at his word. In Arizona, huge semiconductor plants require tens of millions of gallons of water each week, and their executives had been counting on a guaranteed supply under the president's plan. Energy facilities, hydrant manufacturers, and other resource-heavy industries across the Midwest and Pacific Northwest had also been promised an end to their water woes. When Canada refused, those expectations were shattered. Production lines slowed down, work shifts were cut, and businesses began issuing warnings about potential shortages that could impact the electronics, automotive, and even defense sectors. The disruption rippled through the nation's industrial heartland in states like Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin, where Trump had promised a manufacturing renaissance centered on steel and cars. Businesses instead faced layoffs and production halts directly linked to water scarcity. Steel mills scaled back operations. Assembly lines came to a standstill, and workers were left with growing uncertainty about their jobs. The story of a national comeback fueled by resource independence fell apart, replaced by widespread anxiety about whether factories could even continue operating. Energy providers confronted their own crisis. We observed that hydroelectric facilities in the Pacific Northwest, already operating at reduced capacity due to years of low reservoir levels, had pinned their hopes on Canadian water to bridge the shortfall. When that hope was extinguished, utility companies had to scramble to generate power by activating coal and natural gas plants. This move not only reversed years of advancements in clean energy, but also led to higher electricity bills for consumers. The promise of stability had instead resulted in scarcity and increased costs. The political situation was grim. Trump had aimed to project an image of strength and self-reliance, but the incident demonstrated the exact opposite. His administration's demands had been flatly rejected by a smaller neighboring country, revealing the clear limits of American influence. Meanwhile, communities along the border were further alarmed by Trump's hint that the foundational Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, a landmark of international cooperation, could be discarded. This idea caused panic in cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland, where millions of people depend on the lakes for their drinking water. The trust that had been carefully established through international agreements over decades now appeared dangerously weak. The notion that freshwater safeguards could be used as a political pawn left many feeling deeply unsettled. The financial markets reacted without delay. Investors started incorporating water security into their risk assessments, identifying the agriculture and manufacturing sectors as particularly vulnerable. Agricultural stocks saw a sharp decline almost immediately, and the unease extended to technology and energy firms with significant water needs. The resulting market volatility soon affected consumers through higher prices for food, electronics, and energy. Ottawa's firm stance had set off a domino effect that impacted nearly every segment of the American economy. For Canada, this moment represented a crucial turning point. By standing firm, Prime Minister Carney sent a clear signal that national sovereignty was more important than any short-term gains, even when faced with the possibility of American retaliation. Washington had operated for years on the assumption that Canadian resources would always be accessible during a crisis, a silent backup that could be drawn upon at will. That belief was completely shattered, replaced by a stark new reality. Canada was prepared to face the repercussions of its defiance in order to maintain authority over its natural resources. For the first time in decades, America's reliance on Canadian resources was laid bare for all to see. The conflict was about more than just a dispute over rivers. It showed us that water, once widely taken for granted, had emerged as the world's most critical strategic resource. While the 20th century saw global power revolve around oil, today water has taken on that same critical role. The existence of Canada's water reserves had long been a source of quiet reassurance for the United States, suggesting that no matter how severe a drought became, a lifeline to the north would always be available. That sense of security has now vanished, with consequences that are being felt globally all over the world. Water scarcity is reshaping politics in the Middle East. Nations clash over control of the Euphrates and Jordan rivers. In Asia, the Mekong and Brahmaputra rivers create divisions between upstream and downstream countries. Trump's confrontation with Canada did more than just destabilize North America. It positioned Canada as a key player in the worldwide competition for resources. The message to both allies and adversaries was unmistakable. Ottawa was now the guardian of one of the planet's most precious assets. The situation with the Columbia River Treaty highlights how profoundly this moment has altered the international landscape. Enacted in 1961, the treaty was celebrated as a prime example of cross-border cooperation, effectively balancing America's need for flood control with Canada's gains from hydroelectric power. For decades, it stood as a symbol of peaceful resource management, rarely causing any controversy. Trump's move to halt its renewal served as a stark warning that even time-honored agreements could collapse under political pressure. Governments around the world observed this development closely, forcing them to reconsider the dependability of American commitments. For Canada, the treaty became evidence that water could be used as an instrument of national influence. The Great Lakes introduced another layer of complexity as a vital resource for 40 million people and the foundation for hundreds of billions of dollars in economic activity. They are indispensable to both nations. Their shipping channels link North America with Europe, Africa, and Asia. Trump's suggestion of weakening the protections for these lakes not only damaged trust in Canada, but also alerted global markets that the continent's most stable freshwater source could be turned into a political pawn. This uncertainty was sufficient to deter investment and spark concerns that water security could no longer be assumed. Furthermore, Beijing, which has a long history of securing essential resources from African mines to Central Asian pipelines, is now directing its attention to a new target. Discreetly, Chinese corporations have started to explore opportunities within Canada's water sector, proposing investment deals in return for future access rights. For Beijing, water is more than just a commodity. It is the bedrock of survival for its industries and growing urban centers, a resource as vital today as oil was to the West in a previous era. Across the Atlantic, Brussels is formulating its own strategy. European leaders, fatigued by years of persistent droughts, are now viewing Canada not just as a remote ally but as a potential lifeline. The agricultural lands of southern Europe, damaged by one dry season after another, are looking for external solutions. Canadian freshwater is now being integrated into long-term survival plans. What once seemed like mere speculation is now viewed with a sense of inevitability. History provides a cautionary tale. In the 1970s, oil was not expected to be used as a geopolitical tool until the OPEC embargo upended global assumptions and redrew international alliances almost overnight. Water now possesses that same potential for disruption. Prime Minister Mark Carney's rejection of Trump's demands represented more than just a defense of sovereignty. It was a clear statement that Canada now holds a resource capable of transforming global power dynamics. That message is being heard far beyond Washington. In Asia, governments struggling with their own droughts are looking into long-term agreements for Canadian agricultural products. Each new agreement diminishes United States' influence while elevating Canada's international standing. Projections suggest that by 2030, large areas of the American West could be trapped in a state of continuous severe drought. Without cooperation from Canada, the United States will have to turn inward, relying on expensive technologies and strict conservation efforts to manage its needs. The necessary tools are available, but the questions remain. Can they be implemented on a large enough scale and quickly enough? And is the nation prepared to pay the steep price required? The answers to those questions are now being forged in the crucible of a deepening internal crisis. Forced to look within, the United States finds itself fractured along old fault lines that have been dangerously widened by water scarcity. The political landscape is becoming a battleground, not between parties, but between regions. The water-rich states of the Great Lakes and the Northeast versus the parched but populous states of the Southwest. Governors in Michigan and New York are now passing legislation to prevent any future federal attempts to divert water from the Great Lakes, framing it as a matter of state sovereignty and survival. In response, politicians from Arizona and California accuse them of hoarding a national resource, igniting a bitter constitutional debate over who truly owns the nation's water. This infighting has paralyzed Washington, making a unified national response impossible. The federal government's promises of massive infrastructure projects, vast networks of pipelines, and coastal desalination plants have stalled in Congress, bogged down by partisan bickering and astronomical cost projections. Desalination, once hailed as a silver bullet, is proving to be a logistical nightmare. While a few coastal cities have managed to build plants, they are incredibly energy-intensive, driving up electricity costs and putting further strain on an already fragile power grid. The brine byproduct pollutes coastal ecosystems, sparking fierce opposition from environmental groups. For inland states, the option isn't even on the table. Meanwhile, advanced conservation techniques like drip irrigation and large-scale water recycling are being implemented, but they represent a slow, incremental solution to a crisis that is accelerating daily. The scale of the problem dwarfs the pace of the solutions in place. This growing desperation is reshaping American society itself. A slow but steady migration has begun as families and businesses abandon the arid Sunbelt for the greener pastures of the Great Lakes region and the Pacific Northwest. This internal displacement is creating a new class of American climate refugees, straining social services in their destination cities and hollowing out the economies of the places they leave behind. Tensions are rising in cities like Duff and Cleveland as newcomers compete for housing and jobs, while abandoned communities in Nevada and West Texas begin to resemble modern-day ghost town. This internal turmoil has not gone unnoticed on the world stage. As the United States becomes increasingly consumed by its domestic water wars, its global influence wanes. Canada, in stark contrast, finds itself in an unprecedented position of strength. Prime Minister Carney's government is now fielding partnership offers from around the globe. The European Union is finalizing a landmark trade agreement that guarantees long-term access to Canadian agricultural products grown with sustainable water sources. Asian powers are investing billions in Canadian infrastructure, seeking to secure food and resource supply chains that no longer run through the United States. Ottawa is leveraging its water wealth into a new kind of power, becoming a gatekeeper of global stability. Other water-rich nations from Brazil to Russia are watching Canada's strategy closely, realizing that their own rivers and aquifers are strategic assets of immense value. A new geopolitical map is being drawn, divided not by ideology but by hydrology. The 21st century has found its new oil, and the world is quickly discovering who controls the taps. As we stand back and look at the entirety of this unfolding drama, we must recognize that what we are witnessing is not merely a diplomatic spat or a temporary trade dispute, but the definitive end of one era and the turbulent beginning of another. The confrontation over the Columbia River and the Great Lakes is merely the symptom of a much deeper malady that has been festering for decades. For the better part of a century, the relationship between the United States and Canada was predicated on a silent, unwritten assumption that American consumption would always be subsidized by Canadian abundance. We lived in a world where the southern neighbor believed that when the wells ran dry or the forests were depleted, the North would simply open its gates. But history is rarely kind to those who mistake generosity for submission. I believe that Prime Minister Carney's refusal to yield is not just a political maneuver. It is a philosophical declaration that redefines the very concept of national security in the 21st century. We are seeing a profound realization take hold that true power is no longer defined solely by aircraft carriers or stock market valuations, but by the tangible physical capacity to sustain life. The United States, for all its technological might and military supremacy, has collided with the unyielding laws of nature. You cannot print water like you print currency, and you cannot negotiate with a drought. The arrogance of believing that a sovereign nation's natural heritage could be annexed through political pressure has backfired in the most spectacular fashion, accelerating the very decline it sought to prevent.